Good evening, good day, everyone. Sorry, good day, everyone. My name is Tatenda Mshaikwa from Tutorvolt, and I will be tutoring you General Principles of Criminal Law, CRW2601. So before we get into the module, let us just quickly look at what General Principles of Criminal Law means. So from the study guide, you get this definition. General principles of criminal law refers to rules or regulations that are normally applicable to all or most crimes. So what this means is that you'll find that there are rules that apply to most crimes or to all crimes, rules such that they must have been intention, they must have been in negligence, and other rules like that. That is what we mean when we talk about general principles. That being said, let us move on to the course outcomes, what we expect to achieve at the end of this module. The first is, at the end of the module, we should be able to identify and describe the arguments that may serve as a justification for convicting and sentencing a person for crime. Secondly, we should be able to analyze and solve criminal law related problems by identifying, describing, and applying to relevant legal principles. So without further ado, let us get into the module itself. Start with Study Unit 1, Introductory Topics. Learning outcomes for the study unit are as follows. The first, broadly outline the four elements of criminal liability and logical sequences of investigation into those elements. Secondly, know what the four general elements or requirements for criminal liability are. So you see that in your study guide from Section 1.1 to Section 1.4, they are merely introductory topics, and the study guide states that they are not for examination purposes. So you can just read them on your own to gather much information about the historical background of criminal law. You do not necessarily have to, because you'll not be examined on them and when you have to write your exams, but you can just read on them. So let us just jump into what we will be tested on. So 1.5 will move on to criminal liability. So in order to determine criminal liability or for a person to be convicted of a crime, the following must be satisfied and investigated. Firstly, the person's conduct must be recognized as a crime in South African law. So what we are saying about this is that a person to be convicted of a crime, his conduct, the way he acted or the way he conducted himself, should be regarded as a crime in our law. What this means, explaining it further with an example, is that the courts cannot convict a person merely because they are of the opinion that his conduct or her conduct is against social beliefs or is immoral, or that that person is a danger to society. For example, adultery is immoral but does not necessarily constitute a crime. So a person will not be convicted of something if it is not written down or it is not or does not constitute a crime in South African law. So get that right. Simply because something is immoral or is against public opinion or beliefs or against religious beliefs does not mean that it amounts to a crime. So what this is referred to, that a person's conduct must be regarded as a crime in South African law, this is called the principle of legality. However, before we go any further, it should be noted that the principle of legality is not part of the four elements of criminal liability. It is not. So please, whenever you are stuck in an exam or you're thinking you're trying to rack your brain, please remember that principle of legality does not form part of the four elements of criminal liability. So what are the 4 elements of criminal liability? Okay. The first one is act or conduct. The second one, compliance with definitional elements of the crime. The third one, unlawfulness. The fourth one, culpability. So let us examine each one of them and we'll start from the top. Act or conduct. So let us start by defining these terms, act or conduct. So conduct refers to an act or an omission. To explain this further, when someone is regarded to have acted an act, it means that they have actually done something. They've acted in a positive manner. So if someone takes a bat and hits your head, they have acted. They've actually done something. So that is an act. An omission, if someone omits or does not do something, that is taken as an omission. An example is that of a traffic officer who sees a car speeding by, does not stop the car, but the car eventually crashes into another. That is an omission. He did not stop that car when he saw that it was speeding. So conduct is an act or an omission, right? And an act positive, an omission negative. Act positive in the sense that you've actually done something, and negative because you actually have not done anything when you are expected to have done something. So omission comes with legal obligation. That means there is a legal obligation on you to act in a certain way and you do not act in a certain way. That's regarded as an omission. Let's move on further. Please note that when we're talking about an act in criminal law, it is not synonymous or it does not mean the same thing that we use in our everyday lives. So in criminal law, an act is a technical term that will cover an act or an omission. So just to clear that up in case you lost me somewhere, what I'm saying is that in criminal law, someone would have been regarded as to have acted even if they have omitted to act. So you could have acted, yes, literally hit someone with a bat, or you would have omitted to act, failed to stop that car from the speeding car, and that omission would still be regarded as an act. So please note that when we're talking about an act in criminal law, we're not merely talking about someone who has done something per se. We'll also refer to someone who has omitted to actually act in itself. Right. And we move on to act. Now that we have established what an act is and what it means in criminal law and what it entails, we now have to look at when does an act actually give rise to criminal liability or what we know as criminal culpability, either criminal liability or criminal culpability. So an act in criminal law is only an act when it's voluntary. That means a person is able to willfully and intentionally subject his bodily movements to his intellect. That means a person is well aware of what they are doing. So if anything, if a person acts involuntarily, that means that it is not regarded as an act. A very great example that explains, we find it in the study guide, where they say that someone, if X in his sleep is walking and by mistake or in his sleep he's walking and hits someone, that X will not be regarded as to have acted because his movements and his action were not voluntary. He was asleep, so he did not willingly and intentionally subject his bodily movements to his intellect. Another bizarre example of, let's say, take someone who has been hypnotized, that when they hear the word red, then they have to maybe smash a car or something, So if that person hears the word red and then picks up a bat and then smashes a car, that person, because he has been hypnotized, he will not be regarded as to have acted, because remember, it is involuntary. It is not voluntary. So please always note that when you're going to look out for, if like you're given a scenario and then someone has done something, please just be the first thing that you must identify is if this person is this act in this particular question, is it voluntary or is it involuntary? Then just look out for that. It already you would have established is there criminal liability in that instance. If it's involuntary, if you see X was sleepwalking, then automatically you know X did not act because it was involuntary. But if it says X was driving, nothing suggests that it was involuntary, then we know that there's an act, and then we further on investigate other elements. But let's move on to the next one, which is compliance with definitional elements of the crime. So the second element that we find, okay, fine, there's an act. The second one that we have to look at is compliance with definitional elements of the crime. So what this means is it refers to the concise definition of the type, please note type of conduct and circumstances in which that conduct must take place in order to constitute an offense. So that means for every crime, there is a particular and there is a specific way in which a person has to conduct themselves, a person has to act in order for that act or conduct to amount to a specific crime. Just in case you lost me somewhere, let me elaborate. So different types have different crimes, sorry, have different type of definitional elements, right? For example, the example in the study guide, definitional elements of robbery are the violent removal and appropriation or movable corporal property belonging to another. So let us look out at the elements in this crime. We'll look at the violent removal, right, of and appropriation of movable corporal property belonging to another. So if someone will be charged of robbery, that means they must have appropriated something from someone in a violent manner. So the first thing was the violence, right? The second thing we look at was the appropriation of movable corporal property belonging to another. So let's just say you're walking down the street and someone comes up to you and snatches your bag or something, or let's say you're sitting in somewhere and then someone just takes your phone from your bag. Yes, it is corporal property. It belongs to another person and there's appropriation, but because there's no violence, then automatically it is not robbery. So what we mean is that every single crime is things that constitute different elements that will amount to one big crime, but one big crime. So just look out for that. Was there violence? If there's violence, was there appropriation? Was there the appropriation? Was it corporal movable? Yes, because automatically, if it is immovable, if it's a house, then robbery does not fall in place. So just look out for that. And that is compliance with definitional elements of the crime. Let's move on to that. Let's move on to the next, which is unlawfulness. So now we have this act and the conduct, a act's conduct complies with definitional elements of the crime. We now look next at unlawfulness. So it must be noted that simply because someone's act or someone's conduct corresponds with the definitional elements of the crime does not mean that necessarily it will amount to a crime or it is unlawful. So follow me as I explain this. So if a police officer, let's say, is running after a robbery, this is the example in the study guide. If a police officer is running after a robber, sorry, and then knocks them down on the ground and on so that he is able to apprehend them, That police officer, yes, his conduct might comply with definitional elements of assault, yes. But is the thing that we're investigating is it unlawful for that person to have acted like that? All right. So what we're saying is that unlawfulness can be excluded, but by what we call grounds of justification. So, ground of justification means that there simply is a legal, sound reason why a person acted that way, and that because of that reason, this person's act will not amount to be illegal. So, let me explain that again. What I'm saying is that unlawfulness will be excluded by grounds of justification, and ground of justifications are legal sound reason that a person may rely on or give reasons for why he or she acted in such a manner, and his or her conduct will not be illegal. So grounds of justification, which we'll do later on, include self-defense, and it's a very familiar term, and also necessity, right? So those are grounds of justification that the law gives you to use in case you have to defend yourself or you have to act in a certain way in order to protect another person or to just make sure that you do not get hurt. Okay, we move on to the fourth. The fourth element, the last one. We have an act, we have the compliance with definitional elements of a crime, and we have unlawfulness, and we go to the fourth one. We have culpability. So yes, we have all those things, but what culpability entails is that this requirement entails that there must be a basis on which X may be personally blamed for his conduct. So what this means is that now we're looking at the person who has actually done the crime, the actor. And we're looking at different things when you look at this. We're looking at if a person, there are two sub requirements for criminal capacity or culpability. So the first one is the ability to appreciate the wrongfulness of his act, this person's act. And the second one is the ability to act in accordance with such an appreciation. So we're saying the first one, let's go back to the first one, the ability to appreciate the wrongfulness of his act. Is X able to appreciate that what he is doing or what he's about to do is wrong? And then we move on to the second sub, the ability to act in accordance with such an appreciation. So we're saying that now, if X is able to appreciate this, if this is wrong or right, is he able to act with such appreciation? Right. So you find that children and people who are mentally challenged are examples of people who lack criminal capacity, because children are regarded to not have the intellectual maturity or intellectual appreciation of what they do. That like children who do all various stuff. A child may just take a knife and stab someone. Maybe they have seen it somewhere, perhaps, or they just are curious. So children, you find that because they lack that appreciation, they will not be held criminally culpable. Same goes with people who are mentally challenged. Already they have mental and capabilities. So it is very unlikely that they'll be able to discern or to know that what they are doing is actually wrong. Yes. So, and then the second subleg of culpability is that X act must be intentional or negligent. Right. So it's okay that now someone is an appreciation and acts according to such appreciation. The second subleg now is that X must have acted intentionally or negligently. So we are talking, when we say intentional, that act actually intended to do what he did. He, I take my car, I I intentionally drive over someone, that is what I do. Like I've really set it in my mind that this is what I'm going to do, and there you have acted intentionally. You actually had intention to do it. And when we speak of negligence, we're talking that you had a legal obligation to act in a certain way, but you did not. So, hence, you will still be found to be criminally culpable, even though you did not do something because of your negligence. So, what we're talking about when we speak that X has acted negligently, let us take, for example, someone who then is someone who, let's take, for example, the police officer that we spoke about when we started out, who does not stop the vehicle, and the vehicle in turn causes a car crash. This person was negligent in executing their duties, and hence they caused fatalities. So you still be held criminally culpable. You did not do anything, and doing nothing is what will constitute negligence. In most cases, intention, is mostly required, but in some cases, negligence will suffice to have you held criminally culpable. Right. So these are the four elements of criminal liability, and we're just going to run through them again. We have act. Remember, act means you act, or act or conduct means conduct. You have conduct means an act or an omission. Remember, you have acted positively, you have hit X with a bat, or you have omitted to do something, and then you go on to definitional compliance with definitional elements of a crime. And what we're talking about is does X conduct fit with certain requirements that will constitute to a specific crime. It's not this module, there's a module specific crimes, but remember the example of the robbery. Of the robbery, was there violence? Was there appropriation of movable corporal property belonging to another? If all of that, all of those are there, then yes, X will be charged with, or X will be charged with robbery. But if something is missing there, X might be charged with something else, but it definitely will not be robbery. So all the elements of that particular crime should be present. And we go on to unlawfulness. Remember what we spoke about when we spoke about unlawfulness. We're speaking that simply because you have acted voluntarily and yes, your conduct complies, yes, you have violently appropriated someone's movable corporal property, does not necessarily mean that what you did is unlawful, because the law gives you what we call grounds of justification. Grounds of justification, which include self defense, necessity, and etc. And also, the fourth one that gives rise to criminal liability is culpability. And here we're looking at the person who actually acted. Do they have the mental capacity, or are they able to act in appreciation with of right and wrong with that doing? And remember, people who are usually excluded from who are not usually excluded, who are regarded by law to not have criminal capability and capacity, are children and as well as mentally challenged people. Yes, so let us move on to the next part of the study unit, and we go on to the sequence of investigation into presence of elements. So now we're looking at, maybe you've been given a problem type question, and we're just looking at if you're then going to, because all of this is like act plus compliance with definitional elements of the crime plus unlawfulness plus criminal culpability is equals to criminal liability. So when we're investigating into presence of the element, it should be done in a certain order. You have to follow from the top to the act to the criminal liability. So you start by investigating if is there an act. So the moment that you realize that there is no act, then there is no criminal liability. So if then you see from the onset there is no act, then there's no point of you moving forward and investigating, does this act, or does it, is there compliance with definitional elements of a crime? There simply is not, because that would then presuppose that there is actually an act of which there isn't. So just be careful. If something falls away, then automatically criminal liability. With someone cannot be held criminally liable. All right. So remember, in such specific order, and this will really require understanding of your of your, yes, or criminal liability elements, all four of them. You need to understand what constitutes an act, what constitutes definitional elements of a crime, what constitutes unlawfulness, and what constitutes criminal culpability, and what excludes it. And you also must know what excludes an act, what excludes unlawfulness. And then you are able to investigate exactly if a person has criminal liability. Yes. And then just before we go there, in the study guides, there is when they illustrate with the boy with the table and the chair, and who wants to get the kite. So the way they do it, and they try and show that there isn't, that if one thing falls away, then automatically there is no criminal liability. So just to look at the example, so the table represents the act, the chair represents compliance with definitional elements, the child himself represents unlawfulness, the stick represents culpability, and the kite represents liability. So what this means is that this picture, like, just visualize it, and you can also see it in your study guide, that this child is trying to get to the kite. So what do you think happens if you remove this table? So the table and the chair are supposed to give this child height. So the moment that you remove the table, that means this child has lost some height. He's unable to reach the kite. It is practically impossible for him to reach the kite, because now it's shorter. So what we're saying is that the moment that the table is not there, this child cannot reach the the kite. So just look at it this way: the moment you remove the table, which is the act, that person cannot reach criminal liability. Because when you look at the diagram in the study guide, you realize that the end result is to get the kite. So if the chair is removed, or if the boy himself is removed, then ultimately you cannot reach the kite, which is the liability. So just always remember, if the table is not there, that child cannot reach that kite whatsoever, because now he's shorter. If the child himself is removed, which shows unlawfulness, that means, of course, like, it's just a stack of furniture on top of each other, then that means the kite is not there. So if one thing, and follow with me, if one thing is removed, then you cannot retrieve the kite. And if you cannot retrieve the kite, which represents the liability in this instance, that means that there is no criminal liability. Just know that, just always know that that is how it is. That is the principle. So you do not have to investigate further if there is compliance with definitional elements. As I mentioned earlier, you do not have to investigate anything else. It simply falls away. It's a four-legged chair. The moment one leg is there, then the chair cannot stand. So that is just how it is with it. So just make sure, if you're going to give rise to criminal liability, all four legs of the chair are there. And then we move on to the activity in the study guide. So the activity in the study guide reads: assume X is charged with having assaulted Y. Yes. The evidence relied upon by the prosecution to prove the charge reveals one night while X was walking in his sleep. He trampled upon Y, who happened to be sleeping on the floor. His X committed assault. I'll read that again. Assume X is charged with having assaulted Y, right? The evidence relied upon by the prosecution to prove the charge reveals that one night while X was walking in his sleep, he trampled upon Y, who happened to be sleeping on the floor. His X committed assault. That is the activity. Just give you a minute to just think it through before you can flip to your study guide. I know you cannot necessarily give me feedback, but just to have a mental exercise in your head to, if you can quickly identify if is it yes or no without us even getting into the reasoning. All right, let's look at the feedback. And the feedback is there in the study guide, so I'm just going to read and then we can discuss a bit on it, just to clarify things, in just to clarify things, just in case you got stuck somewhere. So the obvious answer is no. X did not commit assault because X was sleepwalking. He did not act voluntarily. Remember, an act only gives rise to criminal culpability if it is voluntary. That's because there's absence of the act. There can be no charge of assault. It is that's not necessary to investigate other elements. It just goes back to what we have been discussing throughout that. Let's go back to our question. Assume X is charged with having assaulted Y. Evidence relied upon by the prosecution to prove the charge reveals that one night, while X was walking in his sleep, sorry, he trampled upon Y, who happened to be sleeping on the floor. Yes. Okay, now we go to look at the to our definitional sorry, to our criminal liability elements, and we look, was there an act? Remember, we start from the beginning. Was there an act? An act only gives rise to criminal liability if it is voluntary. So, what you're asking yourself is not what was there an act. Remember, was there a voluntary act? Please, like as soon as you're able to ask it like that, you probably not go wrong. Because the moment that you perhaps try and ask yourself, um, was there an act, you probably give yourself reasoning. It can get exam pressure or assignment reasoning, but just quickly ask yourself, was there a voluntary act? So in this scenario, was the act voluntary? And because X is sleepwalking, then automatically there is no voluntary act. So conclusion, there was no sorry, X can thus not be charged with assault. So the study guide then explains that under the feedback that it is not necessary to investigate other elements because that will be legally incorrect. And what they mean by that is that if we then go on to investigate if there's compliance with definitional elements, we are assuming that there was an act, and of which there wasn't. So that would make it legally incorrect for us to even say that. That means we'll be then assuming that sleepwalking can be classified as voluntary act, and it is not. So just know that, as we have been discussing, that as soon as one thing falls away, that's where it stops. If you have to go on to, let's say X did, yes, he did act voluntarily. This is hypothetical. Yes, he did act voluntarily. And yes, definitional elements, he assaulted. Yes, there's no grounds of justification. And we get to the last part and it says X is a, is a 7-year old or 6-year old, then criminal culpability has been excluded. So it might be an X that quickly falls away. It might be the table, it might be the chair, it might be the boy, it might be the stick. So whatever it is that falls away, you just then know that as soon as something falls away, then we stop there. Right? That is it. And then that is it. Then just hints for answering problem type questions, because criminal law really has those, and you find your XYZ a lot in this module. But just the first thing to do this is identify the elements and follow the sequence in investigating the presence of these elements. So in your study, in your question that you have been given, let's use the one in our study guide. When we say identify the elements, what are the elements? You already know the elements. If you have to get in the exam and quickly write them down in their order, just do that. Like some sort of formula, then you quickly say, okay, fine, let's identify acts, compliance with definitional elements, unlawfulness, and then criminal culpability. Identify them. As soon as you identify them, are they all present? If they are not present, then you can quickly identify the elements and then follow the sequence in investigating the presence. As you do that, is this present? No, no, no. And then quickly this element. So please familiarize yourself with these elements. They're important. That's like crucial part of this whole module. And then we move on to the second thing. After you identify the elements, the second thing, recite or discuss the legal principles relevant to the scenario you are given. Some of those principles are also found in case law, so be sure to also include those principles. So when we're talking about is that what are the legal principles that relate to the specific scenario that you've been given, right? So you're gonna say, um, well, let's take the one in the study guide. We want to recite, we want to discuss the legal principles that you have. So the legal principles of an act says that an act conduct is an act or an omission, and it also says that act should be voluntary. So, and then this is you discussing and reciting what what constitutes an act, or what constitutes unlawfulness, and what constitutes criminal culpability, whatever the elements that you've been asked. And also, please always pay attention to and just bring in case law. Also refer to case law as you do that. If you do happen to forget the names in an exam, it will suffice for you to just case, but just at the most, the cases that will support act, will support this kind of principle, just be sure to know them. But you will not be penalized necessarily, but just bring in your case law. So after you pertaining to an act or to apply them. So now, remember, in the second part, discussing the question per se. You're just discussing legal principles. That is only that you're doing. You're not talking about why. You're not talking about acts. You're not talking about anything. You're just exhausting the principles that are underlined in the scenario that you've been given. And then the third part, you go now to apply. You bring in those principles and you bring them in to your problem, to your given scenario. So now you're talking about X did not act because in criminal law, an act is only gives rise to criminal liability, not culpability, if it is voluntary. And then if there is a case, you decide you also bring it in X versus Y. It was decided that this, etc., etc., etc. So now you are doing and fusing them with the principles, you're applying it. So just remember, so that it follows a certain type of sequence, just be mindful of that. And the last part, give a conclusion to the problem. Okay, fine, you've identified, you've recited, now you've applied. So what is it that you're concluding? Remember, you've been given a question. So give a conclusion to the problem. You've been given a question. The question is, was there assault? So in your conclusion, you are summing it up. Yes, there was an assault. No, there was not an assault. Because all those things you have done trying to explain and give a big whoever as your right you need to answer the question. Yes, there was. No, there wasn't. Yes, no, X cannot be charged with with assault because there was no act on his part since it was involuntary. Full stop. Then that is your conclusion. So that is it for study unit 1, introductory units. And we in this study unit, we discussed, remember, we discussed elements for criminal liability, act or conduct, compliance with definitional elements, unlawfulness, and criminal culpability. And those are all four elements of criminal liability. Remember to do them in sequence. Remember to be mindful of the things that will try and throw you off, and remember to just look at them in their order, and then you definitely not go wrong. And remember what we said: soon as one falls away, as soon as that chair has three legs, it cannot stand, literally cannot stand. So just know that your criminal liability will also not rise. So that is it from me, and I will see you in the next lesson.